The air felt thick as I stepped through the front door, the smell of freshly baked bread wafting from the kitchen. My wife, Hannah, was busy setting the table, her movements unusually brisk. She looked over her shoulder and gave me a quick smile, but it didn't reach her eyes. "Hey, Matt, dinner's almost ready," she said, her tone too casual, like she was trying to steer me away from something. I dropped my briefcase by the door, pausing to study her. Hannah was radiant as always, her honey blonde hair tied up in a loose bun and her figure effortlessly catching my eye even after 15 years of marriage. But there was something different tonight, an undercurrent of tension in the way she moved. "How was work?" I asked, loosening my tie. "Busy," she replied quickly. "Oh, by the way, there's a company party on Saturday. You know, one of those formal things. But honestly, I doubt it's your scene. You're probably better off relaxing at home." Her words lingered in the air, heavy and deliberate. "Why wouldn't I go?" I asked, tilting my head. Hannah turned to face me, her lips curving into a forced smile. "It's just boring work stuff. You'll hate it. Schmoozing with ad people, listening to pointless speeches. Plus, you've been so tired lately." The way she dismissed it set off a quiet alarm in my chest. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. "I'm not that tired. Besides, I'd like to meet your coworkers. It's been a while since I've been to one of these." For the briefest moment, her smile faltered, replaced by something I couldn't quite name. Annoyance? Panic? "Oh, okay. If you really want to," she said, shrugging like it didn't matter. But I caught the slight tension in her shoulders as she turned back to the stove. The rest of the evening played out uneventfully, but her behavior gnawed at me. She was too eager to dissuade me, too insistent that I stay home. It wasn't like her to care so much about my attendance at a work party. By the time Saturday arrived, I was more determined than ever to go. I dressed in a tailored suit Hannah had bought me for our anniversary, the same one she said made me look irresistible. When I walked into the living room, she glanced up, her breath catching for a moment before she composed herself. "You look great," she said, smoothing her black dress nervously. It hugged her curves perfectly, and for a moment, I was almost distracted from my unease. "Almost. Ready?" I asked, slipping on my watch. She nodded, her eyes darting to the clock. "Yeah, let's go." The venue was a sleek, modern space downtown, filled with the buzz of clinking glasses and soft laughter. Hannah stayed close to me as we mingled, introducing me to coworkers whose names I barely registered. I kept my eyes open, looking for anything that felt off. Then I saw him. A man in his early 50s, salt and pepper hair neatly combed, walked toward us with the kind of confidence that filled the room. His eyes locked onto Hannah, a smirk tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Greg," Hannah said, her voice a little too bright. She stepped slightly closer to me, almost as if to shield herself. "Ah, so this is your husband," Greg said, extending his hand to me. "Nice to meet you. Hannah's told me a lot about you." The handshake was firm, but his tone carried an edge that made my skin crawl. "All good things, I hope," I replied evenly, meeting his gaze. Greg chuckled. "Of course. You've got quite the wife here, one of the best on our team." As the night wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that Greg's eyes were on us, watching. It wasn't just professional admiration. It was something more, something possessive. Later, while Hannah excused herself to get a drink, I stepped outside to clear my head. The cool air helped, but the knot in my stomach remained. When I returned, I froze in the doorway. Greg was standing close to Hannah at the bar, his hand brushing hers as he handed her a glass. She smiled up at him, her expression soft and almost intimate. The sight sent a cold rush through me. I stepped back into the shadows, staying out of view but close enough to observe. "I told you he wouldn't notice," Greg said, his voice low. Hannah glanced around nervously before replying. "He almost didn't come. But Greg, this is risky." He leaned in closer, his hand resting briefly on her arm. "Relax, Hannah. You worry too much." I felt my blood run cold. My wife, the woman I had built a life with, was standing there, sharing a secret moment with another man. I didn't confront them, not yet. I needed to know more. As I watched from the shadows, A sense of resolve settled over me. Whatever was going on between them, I would find out. And when I did, they would both face the consequences. The drive home from the party was suffocating. Hannah sat in the passenger seat, her hands folded neatly in her lap, staring out the window as if the passing streetlights held some great secret. I kept my eyes on the road, my knuckles white against the steering wheel. My mind was a storm, replaying the scene at the bar over and over. Greg's hand on her arm, the way she smiled at him, the words that hinted at something more. "So, did you enjoy yourself?" she asked suddenly, her voice too light, too rehearsed. I glanced at her, noting the careful expression on her face. "It was fine," I replied evenly. "Interesting, actually." Her lips tightened slightly. "Interesting how?" "Oh, just meeting your coworkers." "Greg seems friendly," I said, testing the waters. Her reaction was immediate, a flicker of tension in her posture, quickly masked with a smile. "Greg's a bit over the top sometimes, but he means well. He's been with the company forever." I said, letting the conversation drop. The rest of the drive passed in silence, thick with unspoken words. When we pulled into the driveway, Hannah was out of the car before I could kill the engine. She hurried inside, mumbling something about needing to check her phone. I followed her into the house, but she was already in the bedroom with the door closed. For a moment, I stood in the hallway, staring at the closed door, my chest tightening. I had spent years trusting this woman without question, but now doubt was clawing its way in. I wasn't a jealous man by nature, but something about tonight wasn't sitting right. Greg's familiarity with her, her nervous energy. It was like seeing the edges of a picture I couldn't fully make out. I needed answers. The next day, I took the first step. During lunch, I called an old friend, Ryan. We hadn't spoken in years, but I knew he ran a small private investigation firm downtown. "Ryan, it's Matt," I said when he answered. "Well, damn, Matt. Long time no talk," he replied, his voice warm. "What's going on?" "I need a favor," I said, my tone serious. There was a pause on the other end. This doesn't sound like a casual catch-up. "What kind of favor?" I hesitated, then decided there was no point in sugarcoating it. "I think Hannah might be hiding something. I need you to find out what." Ryan let out a low whistle. "That's heavy, man. Are you sure about this?" "No," I admitted. "But I need to be." Ryan sighed. "All right. Send me what you have, her schedule, work details, anything that could help. I'll start looking into it." That evening, Hannah was in the shower when I slipped into the bedroom and picked up her phone from the nightstand. My hands were shaking slightly as I unlocked it using the passcode I'd known for years. I started with her texts. Most were mundane, conversations with friends, family, and coworkers. But there was a thread with Greg that caught my eye. "Greg, last night was great. You looked amazing in that dress." "Hannah, thanks. It was nice seeing you too." My stomach turned as I scrolled further. "Greg, wish we could talk more openly. He seems like a decent guy, but he wouldn't understand." "Hannah, I know. It's complicated." Complicated. That word sat in my mind like a stone. I took screenshots of the messages and sent them to myself before carefully placing her phone back where I found it. Ryan called me 2 days later with an update. "You're not going to like this," he began, his tone cautious. "She met Greg at a cafe this afternoon. They sat in the back corner, talking for over an hour. It looked intimate." "What do you mean by intimate?" I asked, my grip tightening on the phone. Leaning in close, laughing, touching hands. Nothing overtly incriminating, but it wasn't the way coworkers usually interact, Ryan said. "I've got photos if you want to see them." "Send them," I said, my voice flat. Minutes later, my phone buzzed with a series of images. There they were, Hannah and Greg, heads close together, her hand resting lightly on his arm as they smiled at each other. I stared at the photos, my chest tight with anger and betrayal. This wasn't definitive proof, but it was enough to deepen my suspicions. That night, I couldn't bring myself to confront her. Not yet. Instead, I watched her carefully, noting every detail. The way she avoided meeting my eyes, the faint nervousness in her voice. She was hiding something. I lay awake in bed long after she had fallen asleep, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions. How long had this been going on? Was it just emotional, or had it crossed a line? I didn't have the answers yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to let this slide. Whatever Hannah and Greg thought they were getting away with, they had underestimated me. This was just the beginning. The next morning, I woke up with a heavy resolve. I couldn't let this linger. Suspicion eats away at you like rust on steel, and I wasn't about to let it corrode me. I needed more answers, real, undeniable proof. Hannah was already up, humming quietly in the kitchen. The smell of coffee drifted through the house, but the once comforting scent now felt tainted. I watched her for a moment from the hallway. She was smiling as she flipped through a magazine, her demeanor calm, almost carefree. Was this how someone acted after lying to their husband? Or had she convinced herself that nothing she was doing was wrong? "Morning," I said, stepping into the kitchen. "Morning," she replied, glancing up. Her smile faltered for just a second before it reappeared. "Coffee's fresh. Want some?" "Sure," I said, sitting at the counter. We made small talk, work, weekend plans, our daughter's upcoming visit home from college. I played my part perfectly, keeping my tone light and my expression neutral. But as I watched her move around the kitchen, I noticed the little things. The way she kept her phone angled away from me on the counter, the way her eyes darted toward it every few minutes. She was hiding something. That afternoon, I met Ryan at a diner on the edge of town. He slid into the booth across from me, a manila folder in his hand. "Morning's delivery," he said, pushing the folder across the table. I opened it, my breath catching as I flipped through the contents. Photos of Hannah and Greg at various locations, cafes, hotel lobbies, even parked in her car in an empty lot. "They've been careful," Ryan said, his voice low. "No blatant PDA in public, but their body language says enough." Leaning in, touching, laughing, they're close, Matt. Real close. My hand tightened around the folder. "What about phone records?" "Got those too," Ryan said, sliding over another sheet. "They've been texting and calling almost daily. Some of the messages are short, quick check-ins, but others," he trailed off, his expression grim. I scanned the list of texts, my heart sinking further with each word. "Greg, can't stop thinking about you." "Hannah, me too. You always know how to make me feel special." "Greg, same time next week?" "Hannah, definitely." The final nail in the coffin was a record of calls, one lasting nearly an hour late at night, while I had been asleep in the next room. "What do you want me to do next?" Ryan asked, his voice pulling me back to the present. "Keep following them," I said through clenched teeth. "If they slip up, I want to know." Back at home, Hannah was in the living room, scrolling through her phone. She glanced up as I walked in, her smile warm but hesitant. "You were gone for a while," she said. "Had some errands to run," I replied casually, dropping my keys on the counter. She didn't push further, but I could feel her watching me as I moved through the house. That night, I lay in bed next to her, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced with questions, scenarios, and plans. How far had it gone? Was it just emotional? Or had she crossed that final line? I thought about the photos and messages Ryan had shown me, my stomach twisting. I knew I couldn't confront her yet. Not until I had definitive proof, something she couldn't explain away with a nervous laugh or a weak excuse. The next day, Ryan called with an update. "They've got a meeting scheduled," he said. "Tomorrow afternoon, the hotel on Maple and 8th. You want to be there?" "Yes," I said immediately. When the time came, I parked my car a block away from the hotel, my heart pounding in my chest. Ryan had given me the details. Room 214, check-in at 3 p.m. I sat in the driver's seat, gripping the wheel as I watched the entrance. At 2:55, Greg pulled into the lot in a sleek black car. He stepped out, adjusting his tie as he glanced around. A minute later, Hannah arrived in her car, her face partially obscured by large sunglasses. They didn't acknowledge each other at first, maintaining a safe distance as they walked into the building. I waited for a moment before stepping out of my car and following. The lobby was quiet, the receptionist preoccupied with a phone call. I slipped past her and took the stairs to the second floor, my footsteps silent on the carpeted steps. When I reached room 214, I paused, pressing my ear to the door. Muffled voices came through, low and indistinct. My chest tightened as I strained to make out their words. "Missed you," Greg was saying. "Me too," Hannah replied, her voice soft and familiar, but with a warmth I hadn't heard directed at me in months. I stepped back from the door, my hands trembling. The urge to kick it down and confront them was overwhelming, but I held back. If I was going to do this, I needed to do it right. Pulling out my phone, I started recording, capturing the sound of their voices. It wasn't much, but it was enough to prove they were alone together in that room. As I stood there, listening to the faint sounds of laughter and conversation, something inside me hardened. Whatever love I had for Hannah was being replaced, piece by piece, with something colder. This wasn't just betrayal, it was war. I sat in my car outside the hotel for what felt like hours, though it was likely only minutes. The recording on my phone replayed in my mind. The soft, intimate tone of her voice as she spoke to Greg, the laughter that wasn't meant for me. My grip on the steering wheel tightened until my knuckles turned white. I wasn't the kind of man who acted out of blind rage. I was calculated, methodical. If I was going to confront Hannah, it would be on my terms, and I would hold every advantage. The first step was to gather more evidence. The next day, I met Ryan at his office. He looked up as I walked in, his expression cautious. "Did you go through with it?" he asked. I nodded, sliding my phone across the desk. "Got audio." They were in that room together. Ryan picked up the phone, listening to the recording. When it ended, he leaned back in his chair, shaking his head. "It's enough to prove they were alone, but if you want to make this airtight, we need visuals. Something they can't deny or explain away." "What do you suggest?" I asked. "Video surveillance," Ryan said simply. "I can set up a camera to catch their next meeting. Based on their pattern, I'd say they'll meet again within a week." I agreed. My jaw clenched as I handed him another retainer. "Do it." At home, Hannah's behavior was as sweet as ever, but now I saw it for what it was, a performance. She cooked dinner, asked about my day, and laughed at my jokes, all while hiding a secret that had already poisoned the foundation of our marriage. I watched her carefully, noting every glance at her phone, every moment when her smile lingered too long. That evening, as she stood by the kitchen sink washing dishes, I approached her, my tone casual. "How's Greg doing?" I asked, leaning against the counter. Her hands froze for a split second before she resumed scrubbing. "Greg? He's fine, I guess." "Why?" I shrugged. "Just curious. You two seem close at work." Her laugh was light but forced. "He's just a coworker, Matt. Nothing more." The lie rolled off her tongue so easily it made my stomach turn. 2 days later, Ryan called with the update I had been waiting for. "They're meeting again," he said. "Same hotel, different room. I've got everything set up." My heart pounded as he described the setup. A hidden camera in the hallway outside the room and another that would catch them entering and exiting the building. This time, there would be no doubt. When the day arrived, I stayed home from work, claiming I was sick. Hannah left around noon, dressed a little too carefully for what she claimed was a lunch meeting with her team. I waited for the text from Ryan, and it came an hour later. "They're here. It's happening." The weight in my chest felt unbearable, but I forced myself to stay calm. I knew I couldn't confront her now, not without the full picture. Later that evening, when Hannah returned home, she was all smiles, planting a kiss on my cheek as she breezed into the kitchen. "How was your day?" she asked, her voice light and cheerful. "Uneventful," I replied, hiding the storm brewing inside me. I watched her closely during dinner, searching for any sign of guilt or hesitation. But she played her role perfectly, chatting about work and asking about my sick day. She had no idea the noose was tightening. The next day, Ryan handed me the footage. I sat in his office, staring at the screen as the video played. There she was, walking into the hotel with Greg by her side. They exchanged a brief glance, and she smiled, a smile that used to belong to me. The footage was damning. It showed them entering the room together, and nearly 2 hours later, leaving with flushed faces and slightly disheveled clothes. "Is this enough for you?" Ryan asked. I nodded, my jaw tight. More than enough. That night, I sat across from Hannah at the dinner table, the weight of the evidence pressing down on me. I need to ask you something, I said, my tone calm but firm. Her fork paused halfway to her mouth. What is it? Are you happy? I asked, watching her carefully. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Of course I am. Why would you ask that? Because I'm not, I said, leaning back in my chair. Not anymore. The color drained from her face, and for the first time in weeks, I saw genuine fear in her eyes. Matt, what are you? I interrupted her, my voice cold and steady. I know, Hannah. I know about Greg. I know about the hotels, the texts, the meetings. I know everything. Her fork clattered onto her plate, and she stared at me, her mouth opening and closing like a fish gasping for air. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating. Finally, she whispered, It's not what you think. I laughed bitterly. It never is it? The confrontation had begun, and there was no turning back. Hannah's face was pale, her hands trembling as they rested on the table. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. For a moment, I let the silence hang between us, watching as her carefully constructed facade began to crumble. What do you think you know? She finally whispered, her voice barely audible. I leaned forward, my tone ice cold. I know about the hotel on Maple and 8th, room 214. I know about Greg. I know about the texts, the late-night calls, and the meetings you thought I'd never notice. Her eyes widened in shock, and she instinctively reached for her phone. I caught the movement and shook my head. Don't bother. I've already seen everything. Tears welled in her eyes, spilling down her cheeks. Matt, please, it's not what you think. Don't lie to me, I snapped, my voice sharp enough to make her flinch. I've got photos, audio, and video. So save your excuses. She sobbed quietly, her head in her hands, and for a moment, I felt a flicker of pity, but it was quickly drowned out by anger and the weight of her betrayal. Why, Hannah? I demanded. Why would you do this to us? To me? She looked up, her tear-streaked face filled with desperation. It wasn't supposed to happen, she said, her voice cracking. Greg. He made me feel alive again. I felt invisible, Matt. You were so busy, so distant, and I needed something. I shook my head, disgusted. Something? You needed someone to stroke your ego, and you chose him? It wasn't like that, she pleaded. It started as just talking. I didn't mean for it to go further, but it did. I finished for her, my voice flat. She nodded, tears streaming down her face. Yes. I'm sorry, Matt. I didn't want to hurt you. Too late for that, I said, standing abruptly. You've been lying to me for months, maybe longer. Do you think sorry fixes this? I still love you, she insisted, standing as well. She reached for me, but I stepped back, avoiding her touch. Matt, we can fix this. Please, I'll end it with Greg. I'll do whatever it takes. Whatever it takes? I asked bitterly. The only thing you're going to do is tell me the whole truth. Every detail, every lie. If you want even a shred of forgiveness, you'll give me that. Her face twisted in anguish, but she nodded. Okay, I'll tell you everything. What I didn't expect was how much darker the truth would be. Hannah confessed that the affair had started nearly a year ago, during a work trip with Greg. It began with drinks at the hotel bar and escalated from there. She described how Greg had charmed her, made her feel seen in a way she claimed I hadn't in years. But what shocked me most wasn't the affair itself. It was what came next. It wasn't just about us, she said, her voice trembling. Greg's been using me, Matt. He's been having me sign off on things at work, expenses, reports, even contracts. At first, I thought it was harmless, but now I'm not so sure. I froze. What kind of things? She shook her head, wringing her hands. I don't know all the details. He said it was to streamline processes, but I think he's been embezzling funds. And if that's true, my name is all over those documents. The room spun as I processed her words. This wasn't just infidelity. It was something much bigger. Do you realize what you've done? I asked, my voice rising. If he's been committing fraud, and you've been helping him, you're an accomplice. I didn't know, she cried. I swear, Matt, I didn't know. I just signed what he asked me to because I trusted him. I was stupid, I know that now. I paced the room, my mind racing. Greg wasn't just a homewrecker. He was a criminal. And now, thanks to Hannah's blind trust, we were both potentially implicated in his schemes. Where are the documents? I demanded. They're at work, she said quickly. On my computer in a shared drive. Can you access them remotely? Yes, but... Then do it, I said, cutting her off. Over the next hour, Hannah logged into her work account and pulled up the files Greg had her sign. My stomach churned as I scanned the spreadsheets and expense reports, each one riddled with red flags. Fake vendor names, inflated invoices, and payments to non-existent accounts. It was all there, and it was damning. This is bad, I muttered, rubbing my temples. Really bad. What do we do? Hannah asked, her voice small. We. I snapped. There is no we. You got yourself into this mess, and now I have to clean it up. Her face crumpled, but I ignored her. I picked up my phone and dialed Ryan, my voice grim as I explained the situation. This just got a lot more complicated, I said. Greg isn't just sleeping with my wife. He's committing fraud. And Hannah's name is all over it. Ryan let out a low whistle. You've got a real mess on your hands, Matt. What's the plan? Expose him, I said firmly. But not before I make sure he takes the fall for everything. I'm not letting him drag me, or Hannah, down with him. As I hung up, I looked at Hannah, who sat trembling on the couch. This isn't over, I said. Not by a long shot. The days that followed were a blur of planning and careful execution. Greg had turned what should have been a personal betrayal into a professional disaster, and now it was my responsibility to ensure he bore the brunt of it. I wasn't just cleaning up Hannah's mess, I was protecting my future. I worked closely with Ryan, who analyzed the files Hannah had accessed. The fraudulent transactions were glaring, but Greg's cunning showed in how he'd manipulated Hannah into unwittingly signing off on them. Her digital trail led to documents that would make her look like an accomplice if this went public. If you want to clear her name, you need to gather more evidence, Ryan said during one of our late-night strategy sessions. We have to show Greg as the mastermind, then we go after him, I replied. Hard. Step one of the plan involved Hannah. She didn't like it, but she owed me, more than she could ever repay. I needed her to arrange another meeting with Greg, a private one. Why? She asked nervously, sitting across from me at the dining table. Because I need him to incriminate himself, I said. If I can catch him admitting to the fraud, you're in the clear. Her eyes darted to the side. What if he doesn't say anything? Then we'll push him, I replied firmly. Reluctantly, she agreed. She texted Greg under my supervision, arranging to meet him at the same hotel where they'd been meeting. The message was simple and vague enough not to raise suspicion. Can we meet tomorrow? I need to talk about the invoices. Greg's response came quickly. Same place. Usual time. The next day, Ryan and I arrived at the hotel an hour before Greg. We rented the room next door to theirs, setting up recording equipment to capture audio and video through the thin walls. Ryan had brought a parabolic microphone, ensuring we wouldn't miss a single word. When Greg arrived, I felt a surge of anger at the sight of him strolling casually into the hotel like he owned the place. He carried himself with that smug confidence I'd come to loathe. Hannah arrived shortly after, her nervous energy palpable. I watched through the camera feed as she greeted Greg in the hallway, her smile tight and forced. Once inside the room, the audio feed came to life. You seemed urgent in your message, Greg said, his tone casual. What's going on? I've been thinking about those invoices, Hannah began, her voice wavering. Some of them don't add up, and I'm worried. Worried? Greg laughed lightly. Hannah, you've got nothing to worry about. I've handled everything, but my name is on them, she pressed, her voice trembling. If something happens, I'll be the one they come after. Greg's tone shifted, becoming more serious. Listen to me, Hannah. No one is going to find out. I've been doing this for years, and I know how to cover my tracks. You're safe. Ryan gave me a thumbs up. The microphone had picked up everything. But what if they do? Hannah asked, her voice rising slightly. What if someone audits the accounts? Then I'll handle it, Greg snapped, his irritation seeping through. You think I'm stupid enough to leave a trail that leads back to me? Your name is on everything, not mine. There it was, the admission I needed. When Greg left the hotel, Ryan and I followed him, staying a safe distance behind. He drove to his office, and we watched as he entered the building after hours. Ryan handed me a pair of binoculars. What's he doing? I asked. Could be covering his tracks, Ryan replied. Sure enough, Greg emerged an hour later carrying a briefcase. We tailed him to his house, noting every detail. I had no doubt that whatever was in that briefcase could help solidify the case against him. Over the next week, Ryan compiled all the evidence we had gathered: audio recordings, video footage, financial records, and Greg's late-night activities. The file was damning, painting a clear picture of his scheme and the way he had manipulated Hannah into unwittingly participating. Once everything was ready, I scheduled a meeting with the legal department at Hannah's company. She protested at first, terrified of the fallout, but I convinced her it was the only way to clear her name. If you don't do this, he'll keep using you, I said. You'll never be free of him. Reluctantly, she agreed. The meeting was tense. The head of legal, a sharp woman named Rachel, listened carefully as I laid out the evidence. Her face remained impassive as she flipped through the documents and played the audio clips. When it was over, she leaned back in her chair, her eyes narrowing. This is serious, she said. If what you're saying is true, Greg has put the company at significant risk. But why bring this to us instead of the police? Because I want this handled internally first, I replied. If you act quickly, you can contain the damage and protect the company's reputation. Greg will go down, but Hannah's involvement can be minimized. Rachel studied me for a moment before nodding. Leave it with me. We'll take care of it. 2 days later, Greg was fired. The official reason was violations of company policy, but the truth was much darker. Internal investigators uncovered enough evidence to involve law enforcement, and Greg was arrested on charges of embezzlement and fraud. Hannah's name was cleared, though the scandal left her shaken. When the dust settled, she turned to me with tears in her eyes. I don't know how to thank you, she said. I stared at her, my expression unreadable. Don't thank me, Hannah. Just don't expect forgiveness. Hannah's tears didn't move me. Her apologies, her promises to change, it all felt hollow. Too much had been broken, and no amount of contrition could fix what she had shattered. I let her words hang in the air, offering no response as I turned and walked out of the room. My focus shifted to the final stages of my plan. Greg's arrest and the fallout from his crimes were satisfying, but I wasn't done. There were still loose ends to tie up, and I intended to end this chapter of my life on my terms. The next morning, I met with my lawyer, a no-nonsense man named William Price. He had been by my side through many of life's challenges, and I trusted him implicitly. I want to file for divorce, I said, sliding a stack of documents across the table. William glanced at the papers, then back at me. Are you sure about this, Matt? Divorce is messy, especially with assets like yours. You're looking at a significant financial hit. I'm sure, I said firmly. I've already prepared for it. Hannah can take what she's entitled to, but I'll make sure she doesn't get a penny more. William nodded, scribbling notes on his legal pad. We'll start with mediation, but if she fights it, we're ready for court. You've built a solid case with everything you've uncovered about Greg and the affair. That will work in your favor. Back at home, I found Hannah in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She looked up as I entered, her eyes red and swollen. We need to talk, I said, sitting across from her. She nodded silently, bracing herself. I'm filing for divorce, I said, my tone flat. Her face crumpled, and for a moment, I thought she might collapse. Matt, please. We can fix this. We can go to counseling, start over. I'll do whatever it takes. It's too late, Hannah, I said, shaking my head. You made your choices, and now I'm making mine. This marriage is over. Tears streamed down her face as she pleaded with me, but I stood my ground. I wasn't angry anymore, just tired. I'll make sure you're taken care of, I said, standing to leave. But this is the end. The divorce proceedings were surprisingly smooth. With Greg's scandal still fresh in everyone's minds, Hannah was eager to avoid further embarrassment. She agreed to a fair settlement, keeping the house and a modest share of our savings. Once the paperwork was finalized, I packed my bags and moved out, leaving the house and the memories it held behind. Months passed, and life slowly began to stabilize. Greg's trial made headlines, and he was sentenced to 5 years in prison for embezzlement and fraud. His name became synonymous with scandal, and his reputation was irreparably destroyed. As for Hannah, she kept a low profile, working to rebuild her life. She reached out to me once, asking for forgiveness, but I couldn't give her what she wanted. Forgiveness isn't something I can offer, I told her. Not yet. Maybe not ever. She nodded. Her eyes filled with regret, and that was the last time we spoke. One evening, I sat on the deck of my new home, a small but cozy house overlooking the water. The air was warm, the sky painted in shades of orange and pink as the sun dipped below the horizon. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of peace. The road to this moment had been long and painful, but it had taught me something important. Betrayal doesn't define you. How you rise from it does. I raised a glass to the setting sun, a quiet toast to new beginnings. The past was behind me, and the future was mine to shape.